What's unfolded in Ukraine is an unmitigated tragedy. Lives have been torn apart simply to satiate one man's thirst for expansion. Many wish the West could do more to stop Russia. Some, even including the Ukrainian president, have called for a no-fly zone. But Western leaders have flatly ruled out any military intervention even before Russia invaded. And a big reason for this is because of a tragic calculation of risk, which means that, all things considered, Russia is essentially free to do a lot of damage if it really wants to. Let's get into it. In short, Western leaders fear that military intervention could escalate to an all-out war with Russia. But not just any war, a very specific kind of war, nuclear war. And that's one of the parts of this war which sets it apart from so many others in recent decades. We've almost become used to the ease with which the West can intervene in different parts of the world. And to be sure, it doesn't always go well, and quite a few people argue that the West just shouldn't become militarily involved in any part of the world. Certainly too, there's almost always a very real human cost to intervention, not to mention a financial one. But the basic integrity of the homeland is not usually in question. For the most part, life carries on as normal, as wars are fought perhaps thousands of miles away. But Ukraine is entirely different. The enemy is Russia, a nuclear-armed state. It brings mutual assured destruction, or MAD, into play. The theory holds that if two or more nuclear powers were to deploy their nuclear arsenals against one another, it would result in their total annihilation, not to mention severely damage the global ecosystem for anyone who manages to survive. Many people believe that the fear of that terrible possibility is one of the key reasons why the Cold War never broke out into full-scale war between the US and the Soviet Union. Even if a conflict started small, it could escalate into nuclear warfare and total catastrophe. Because of this, some believe that having nuclear weapons is on balance a good thing because it prevents war between the world's most powerful countries. This is known as nuclear deterrence. But Ukraine has shown that that's just one side of the story. By the logic of nuclear deterrence, so long as nuclear powers are at peace and aren't doing anything really bad in the world, nuclear weapons have a positive effect by ensuring peace, leaving aside the matter of whether it's safe to have them at all. But the moment a nuclear power does something truly terrible, such as waging a war of aggression as Russia has done against Ukraine, the existence of nuclear weapons has a really negative effect. It goes from something which prevents war to something which actually enables war. In some ways, it shields a country from the most severe consequences of waging a completely unjustified war. It gives the country some degree of impunity. No doubt, sanctions, protests, and other ways of pushing back on Russia can have some effect and might eventually force it to back down. But unfortunately, the basic reality on the ground is that if it is steadfastly committed to the war, Russia can proceed safely assured that the West is highly unlikely to take direct military action against it out of fear of nuclear retaliation. And even if Russia does eventually back down, it's already caused terrible loss of life and destruction in Ukraine. A lot of damage has already been done, and it was done knowing that the West was unlikely to provide a military challenge. And to be sure, the West obviously isn't wrong to be so vigilant against nuclear war. It's entirely understandable that they don't want to risk Russia launching nuclear weapons at their cities. Especially too because some have come to fear that Putin might not be of sound mind, increasing the risk of nuclear war even further. It just means that we're in a truly tragic situation, partly driven by the existence of nuclear weapons, one which doesn't have any easy answers, and Ukrainians suffer for it. If we lived in an alternate reality where nuclear weapons didn't exist, Western leaders might well calculate the risks very differently. Ideas like no-fly zones, which are by no means easy or without risks as Christoph Bergs has discussed, might be seriously considered. After all, we mustn't forget that Russia's invasion may be the largest in Europe since the Second World War. It shakes Europe to its core and revives the dark memories of the 1940s when millions were subjected to harsh and deadly rule. Nobody wants war, but in this alternate reality without nuclear weapons, without the risk of nuclear annihilation holding them back, Western leaders might well decide that the time is right to firmly push back on Russian aggression, even if that means conventional warfare of some kind. But in our current nuclear-armed reality, the risk of nuclear war is simply too great for Western leaders to seriously consider military intervention to help Ukraine. It's an understandable yet tragic calculation, and one can't help but worry whether this might embolden other nuclear powers around the world with their own expansionist ambitions. China has long had its sights on Taiwan. The same tragic calculation that prevents the West from military intervention in Ukraine might similarly prevent the world from military intervention to help Taiwan in a future conflict with China. Sadly, I'm not aware of much that can be done about this. We can hope that non-military measures can make aggressors heard enough to stop them, but that might not be enough. And as for a future without nuclear weapons, the efforts at disarmament and non-proliferation seem to have stalled. We may keep facing these tragic situations for some time to come, and in the here and now, Ukrainians suffer the consequences.